This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is 1980's The Changeling, directed by Peter Medak. I became familiar with the work of Peter Medak from television, from the second year of Space 1999, where he directed quite a few episodes. And he has a very interesting kinetic style. I'm also aware of him from Species 2, which is probably the ugliest film I have ever seen. Which is not to say it's shot badly. I mean, its creature effects are just ugly. Not only gross ugly, I just mean visually unattractive. It's an odd movie, especially when you take into account that it's nothing like the first movie from a production and creature design standpoint. In any case, Medak also directed The Changeling. And The Changeling is probably among one of the best ghost stories ever put to film. In some quarters, it's described as a haunted house movie. And I can see why people do that, though I don't think it is. In the sense that while a lot of the action indeed takes place in a house that's haunted, The Changeling is more than that. Part of what makes this movie so great is the fact that the story is larger than that. The movie begins on a winter day, and there's a family. George C. Scott plays the father, and they have car trouble, so they're pushing their car on the road. And so Scott goes to make a phone call at a nearby telephone booth. 1980, before cell phones. And so another car navigating the same road loses control and crashes into his wife and child. Now, this trauma that George C. Scott's character carries plays a huge role in the movie. He eventually comes upon this house, which he rents for a time. And that's when these weird occurrences start to happen. As I said earlier, what sets The Changeling apart, first off, is that there's a serious story behind it. It's not just someone happens to go to a house and bad things begin to happen to them. It's not like there is an Indian burial ground under this house. The house was the site of a tragedy, though. But Scott's own grief apparently seems to trigger these events happening. In other words, based upon the way the story is told, it's quite likely that nothing would have happened if anyone else had moved into that house. The fact that Scott was in pain already somehow made him more susceptible to the influence of this entity. And so it began to use him to try to solve its own murder. And this is, as I said, an interesting story. Another thing about Medak's movie, it's not like other horror movies of the period, which is to say there is no gore, and all the tension is derived from camera work and sound design, which is really interesting when it's done well. And I mentioned Medak's work on Space 1999 and his use of camera angles. And you see the same thing in The Changeling, which is to say the camera is oftentimes positioned in very atypical ways. Dutch angles, the man loves them. But you'd also have a camera, let's say, from the angle of the floor, upward, from the end of a hall, from all kinds of odd angles. This gives the movie a tension and a creepiness that all the buckets of gore in the world couldn't bring. So it's just so well shot and directed by Peter Medak. If I had one criticism of The Changeling, it's that I'm not crazy about the casting of George C. Scott. The casting of George C. Scott in The Changeling reminds me of his casting in Firestarter, based on the Stephen King story, which is to say, he was too old for the role. And by my reckoning, he feels too old in The Changeling as well. It's something about the way he acts. It's not that it's bad by any stretch. It's simply that I think a younger person would have better carried off the role. It's just, there's a regal quality to George C. Scott, and I don't think it works very well in this role. Though I mentioned earlier that I think it's more of a ghost story than a haunted house story. And while it is indisputably both of those things, the house seems almost incidental to me, in the sense that I think the ghost story and the mystery behind the Changeling is so strong that the house is interesting, but it never really becomes a character. It's a place where events unfold, but the movie is not necessarily centered around it, which is to say, you could have changed that house to virtually anything. Having that crime happen anywhere, you didn't need the house to make this work. And I guess that's why, in my own mind, I find it very difficult to think of The Changeling as a haunted house story, because that element is certainly there. But it's so strong, atypically strong for that matter, that the house is not necessary. It is first and foremost a ghost story, and a damn good one. It also stars Melvyn Douglas, who starred in Ghost Story, which treads very similar ground to The Changeling. And Ghost Story is based on Peter Straub book, a really good book, by the way. Though the feature film adaptation of Ghost Story is not that great. It's not bad, it's just not that great. And The Changeling is, while I don't think I'd call it a masterwork, I do think it is probably one of the best ghost stories ever put to film. And if you're interested in checking out The Changeling, it's currently on Tubi. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or follow.